All right, we are recording.
Hi, everybody. Thank you again for joining us for an episode of Capital Corner. My name is Jake Posik. I'm the Director of Communications here at Maine Policy Institute, joined today by our policy analyst, Nick Murray. We have a lot of stuff to unpack today. The legislature is convening tomorrow in Augusta at the Civic Center for another special session. And there's been a lot of news coming out of the governor's office with supplemental budgets and how to spend these ARPA funds. And so we got a great episode in store for you today. And I will turn it over to you, Nick. If you want to begin, let's unpack this jobs and recovery plan. People might remember last year, Governor Mills had complete authority to appropriate the $1.25 billion in CARES Act funds, kind of the first wave, if you will, of federal aid to states. And now earlier this year, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act, and we're getting another wave of federal cash. So talk about that and how Governor Mills wants to spend that.
That's right, Jake. I'm glad to do it. So yeah, this is another $1 billion plus that is coming to the state of Maine via the federal government and federal taxpayers. The difference with this one, like you mentioned, the coronavirus relief funds last year, the governor was able to spend unilaterally those funds. They have an accounting on the website, but what's different this year after this January is that any expenditure from this next bit has to come from a majority vote of the legislature. That's per the last Maine supplemental budget. So it changes things a little bit. All of this has to go through legislative approval, but like I said, only needs a majority vote. So this plan that the governor is putting out, it has some good things. It puts $80 million into the unemployment trust fund, something that just should be shored up. They want to put some money towards the auditor, the state auditor, to make sure this money is spent the right way. There's a lot of Treasury guidance that says how states and localities can spend this stuff. They can aid businesses and nonprofits who are still reeling from the shock of the shutdowns in the midst of the pandemic. Give premium pay to frontline workers, invest in certain types of infrastructure that's sewer, water, and broadband, so not roads and bridges, interestingly. And they're able to replace lost tax revenue from the pandemic and shutdown shock. So, I don't think it would surprise you, but not much of Governor Mills' plan goes to much else outside of some of these grants for different targeted businesses. So there's targeted industry development incentives for fishing, forestry, these sort of heritage industries that we talk about in Maine, as well as for startups, for worker training through the career and technical education. Some of this goes through Maine Technology Institute. Generally, it's a lot of targeted economic development by way of grants that the state is giving to certain businesses and educational entities, all this while the cost of UMaine tuition is going up 2.5%, by the way. But it's interesting, a lot of it's built on public-private partnerships. In a piece that we just published on mainepolicy.org, breaking down this, I cite a couple studies about how these targeted economic incentives don't necessarily work the way that politicians want them to, because when you have all of these targeted incentives, you can move and reallocate money in the economy in a way where it doesn't provide the sort of adaptability and versatility that the economy really needs. There's a study that shows the more targeted economic development in a state, the fewer startup businesses there are, and then the lower number of overall startups, the worse it is for workers to be able to move in between jobs. It lowers their mobility. So it's sort of a counterintuitive thing, but a lot of this targeted economic development ends up just being superfluous spending that the state spends via federal dollars. So, what we're saying is that there are a lot of ways that the state can, and localities can, incentivize better ways of governance. The state can't use this money, this federal money, to lower taxes or delay tax increases, but the localities can do that. So what we're saying is, if Governor Mills wants to support workforce training, workforce development, which is clearly an issue here with the labor shortage and the fact that so many folks are looking for skilled workers, why don't you pair some of this money with maybe localities to reduce their regulatory burden or their tax burden, or pair it with some way to cut some onerous licensing for occupations, for workers, and for businesses. There interestingly is one line where it talks about regulatory reform, but it's only $8 million, and it's for it looks like a one-time technology update. This plan is light on specifics, But what we're looking at is wondering how that's going to work out, and why isn't there any sort of real comprehensive regulatory reform paired with that? So, like I said, this money, this federal money, can't be used to delay state tax increases or to cut taxes. But as we know, another pot of revenue has arisen for the state due to the last revenue projections. So Jake, if I could throw it back to you, we know the governor has a supplemental budget coming up to use another almost $1 billion of extra revenue coming into the state. How are they looking to spend that? And is there any hope for us to get some of these incentives for states and localities to lessen the tax and regulatory burden?
I wouldn't hold my breath on the latter part of that, Nick. I think it's interesting, though, the point you raised related to, the state can use these federal funds to replace lost revenue, but you can't actually use it to reduce the tax burden. However, that prohibition, as you mentioned, does not exist on the local level. And if you look at the governor's supplemental budget, they're talking about an additional $187 million for public education. That's intended to take some of the burden off of local property taxpayers, in addition to increasing the revenue sharing in the state of Maine up to 5% in the second half of the upcoming biennium. And so when you couple that with the funds that these municipalities are going to receive as a result of the American Rescue Plan Act, you can go to mainepolicy.org, see that article that Nick was just mentioning, and within it is a link to a form that has, or a page, I should say, that lists all the different disbursements that every locality in the state of Maine is going to receive, whether it's a county government, city government, town municipal government. It's all there and you can see it. So it really gets hard to understand or wrap your head around why, with the increased revenue sharing, with the increased state spending on education, plus the giant pot of money that's being dispersed out to all these different localities in Maine, gets really hard to justify local property tax increases.
No kidding.
Yeah.
The state is looking to bond more too. So
Yeah, and that's an issue in and of itself for sure.
right.
But as it relates to the rest of this supplemental, so viewers might remember earlier this year in March, the legislature approved a majority budget, simple party lines vote that was $8.3 billion in new spending for the next biennium. And so this supplemental package draws on an estimated 940 million additional dollars that the state is expected to receive as a result of the most recent revenue forecasting committee report. And so some of the big items in it anyway, as I mentioned, that 187 million for public education. But what I also thought was really interesting, kind of buried in that release, Nick, was $32 million that the governor is kind of baking into the cake here as it relates to lost tobacco tax revenues. And it's interesting why that would be included, considering there hasn't been a bill yet that has passed in the legislature to ban flavored tobacco products, but there are a couple different proposals that aim to do such a thing. And so by including that in her supplemental budget, Nick, I would say it seems like almost a sure bet at this point that the governor and her allies in the legislature will quickly be moving to prohibit the sale of flavored tobacco products in the state of Maine.
Yeah, it's really too bad. Massachusetts implemented a similar ban last June after passing it in 2019. And, they estimated they would lose some revenue, but it ends up that they're losing about 20% more than they had expected. Meanwhile, convenience store sales for those exact products that they've banned in Massachusetts are going up dramatically in New Hampshire and in Rhode Island across the border. There's no reason why Maine wouldn't see the same sort of exodus of this money, economic activity, tax revenue over the border into New Hampshire, instead of doing anything to depress the rates of usage for tobacco users, Jake. So it's unfortunate that Governor Mills has gotten caught up in this narrative that somehow flavored tobacco being on the shelves is alone a bad thing for youth or a bad thing for ethnic minorities or whatever the reasoning is today. It's really just going to end up in less money in the state's coffers and no change in the folks using tobacco in New England.
Yeah, people in Maine are undoubtedly familiar with cross-border consumption. I'd say people have been doing it for decades already, whether it's certain tobacco products, certainly alcohol. I know plenty of people who, anytime they leave Maine, they'll stop up on alcohol on their way back through in New Hampshire. That brings us to our next topic, though, Nick. There have been some changes as well, unrelated to spending issues in the state of Maine, but kind of freedom and liberty issues, and what us free humans are allowed to do, in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic and all that's been going on. New guidance from the federal CDC, new guidance from the Maine CDC came out last week, all on the same day. Bring us up to speed on all that.
That's right. Yeah. So, like you mentioned, really affects folks' general freedom to live their lives, and this is something that we've been critical of the governor, of these various changing regional rules for business restrictions, capacity restrictions, various guidance in quotes from federal and state authorities. So we are seeing some progress here, and but we are seeing some things that are concerning as well. So last week, Governor Mills and Dr. Shaw, the Maine administration, announced a change to our plan where all the capacity limitations and physical distancing requirements for outdoor settings would be lifted, as well as indoor masking and distancing requirements for certain indoor settings as well. What's interesting is that on the same day that Maine announced this change, the CDC, the federal CDC, announced a similar but different change where they said they made the distinction that fully vaccinated individuals would be able to not wear a mask, or would be free to not wear a mask in these indoor situations as well. It's interesting to note that this guidance came out literally at the exact same time that Governor Mills was administering this press conference on this change of rules. So the state wasn't able to adjust their rules on that. So the following day, they come out and they remove some of the exemptions that the state had put in. Initially, they had said, you had to keep your mask on if you were eating or drinking. Of course, the bars and restaurants have been an easy scapegoat for, spread of the virus, even though there's very little science to back this up. But as you and I know, Jake, the science gets to be malleable based on the situation. It's not necessarily the policy reflects the science. And so now we're seeing that, the federal CDC has changed their guidance as of last week to no longer require vaccinated individuals to wear masks indoors. Yet the state of Maine is holding on to our somewhat arbitrary reopening timeline and not instituting this similar guidance until May 24th. It's important to note that, determining who is a fully vaccinated individual is not necessarily something that's cut and dry for businesses or for government. The state and the federal government had said that they're not going to pursue a policy, or they haven't been looking at a policy to verify whether folks have been vaccinated. And so I think it's just another instance of where the state and Governor Mills and Dr. Shaw are really just gauging the political situation of this. They're gauging public opinion, and they're trying not to change things too drastically, but also at the same time, whatever science is out there, or whatever rules are out there that need to be changed, it's necessarily they don't really line up with each other, let's say. So we've been watching this closely, and we're wondering why we had to wait an extra 10 days to follow the CDC's guidance, and why the same day the Mills administration couldn't align with their guidance. We still have mask mandates mostly for children in schools. In a lot of places, the summer camp guidance still stresses this mask wearing for children, even though they're outside. We've seen science over and over and over again prove that asymptomatic transmission, as well as outdoor transmission, and as well as the risks to children, is extremely low, and it's not worth governing on these exceptions to the rule. And so I think we're seeing political leaders finally start to understand this and realize they have to take a balanced approach. But when they've been saying that they're following the science the whole time, the science hasn't changed for months, but now things are changing. So we're asking questions about that, but I think that we have hope that things are starting to get back to normal. We need a real summer tourist season in order to get our economy back going, in order for folks to feel like they can come to Maine and they can live and work here. And not be looking to Florida or other states that have opened without adverse consequences in order to go live. We've constantly had this pressure of folks moving to Florida and New Hampshire and other states that have low taxes, and now we see another pressure of folks moving from Maine to these states that are allowing people to even run a business and to live in society based on these sort of unscientific, constantly changing mandates.
Thanks for that, Nick. Yeah, it's I hope after all of this is done and behind us that we never hear follow the science ever again. But I highly doubt that will be the case. But nonetheless, thank you all for tuning in. As I mentioned at the top, the legislature will be convening again in Augusta tomorrow, so we'll have more to report later in the week. Tune back in, subscribe, follow us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and get updates every time the legislature does something of note. Thanks for watching.